Darren Holt lifted his hand, and the music cut off. The sudden silence cracked through the banquet hall, breaking the rhythm of clinking glasses and laughter. Every face turned toward him, waiting for another toast. Instead, he smirked and said loudly enough for the entire board to hear, "Cassia Vale, your services are no longer required. Security will see you out." The words landed like a slap. My glass trembled in my hand as the applause for the $480 million contract collapsed into whispers. Just minutes earlier, I had been celebrated as the architect of Holt Global's biggest deal, the one that would cement our reputation for a decade. Now, I was being erased in the same room, in front of the same people, without warning or defense. 17 years of my life had been poured into this company. I wasn't the face on magazine covers, but I was the one who kept billions of dollars moving safely through our systems. I wrote the clauses that calmed nervous investors, the frameworks that survived downturns. I worked through endless nights, missed family milestones, and ignored the doctor's warnings about my heart. I believed sacrifice would mean loyalty. I believed results would mean respect. Darren believed otherwise. He hadn't built anything. He married into power. The CEO's son-in-law, groomed for influence, hungry for recognition he hadn't earned. Months earlier, I had blocked one of his reckless investment schemes in front of the board, exposing the cracks in his numbers. His pride never recovered. Tonight was his revenge. The CEO, his father-in-law, sat in silence, letting Darren's words stand as fact. Around us, executives avoided my eyes, unwilling to confront nepotism, even as it poisoned the very company they claimed to protect. Betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. The shuffle of feet, the awkward clearing of throats, the way people you trusted pretend they never knew you. But not every gaze fell away. At the far end of the table, one of our largest investors studied me with steady eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't rise to defend me. But then, with a subtle tilt of his chin, he nodded once. It was small, almost invisible, but it pierced through my shame. It told me something Darren would never understand. Power doesn't vanish just because music stops. Sometimes, it waits in the silence, in the hands of the one who still holds the key. The applause and laughter from that night still echoed in my ears as I walked away from the banquet hall. But inside, all I heard was the hollow thud of betrayal. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to demand that 17 years of sacrifice not be reduced to a single humiliating moment. But instead, I carried the silence with me, the kind of silence that settles heavy on the chest and reminds you how easily loyalty can be discarded. 17 years. That number wasn't just time, it was cost. I remembered the endless flights across time zones, the hotel rooms where the minibar became dinner, the sterile glow of spreadsheets at 2 a.m. I remembered promising myself that one day, when the company was secure, I would slow down, but slowing down never came. Instead, I buried myself deeper, working until my chest ached, brushing off the dull pressure as something I could fix later. Later never arrived. There was the night I collapsed in my office, waking up hours later on the floor, papers scattered around me. I thought no one had noticed, but a janitor left a bottle of water and a sticky note, "Take care of yourself." The next morning, I was already back at my desk, leading a crisis call with investors in London. And there was the hospital stay, the one I told no one about. The cardiologist's face was grave as he warned me I was pushing my heart too far. But even in that hospital bed, IV lines in my arm, I had my laptop open, drafting an emergency addendum to reassure a panicked investor group. I told myself the company needed me more than I needed rest. In truth, I was terrified of being forgotten if I stepped away. That was the weight of my 17 years. Not just hours worked, but health surrendered. I had given Holt Global my body, my mind, and every quiet piece of my life. And yet, As much as resentment coiled in me like a burning wire, there was still pride. Quiet pride. I knew the company hadn't survived by luck or lineage. It had survived because I was relentless, because when crises came, I held the line, because investors trusted me, not the family name on the building. That pride was why I insisted, years ago, on a safeguard clause most of the board had dismissed as a technicality, a protection written into every major contract. Any deal over $500 million required my digital authorization. No exceptions. Without it, the contract stood incomplete, funds unsecured, capital reversible within 24 hours. At the time, the CEO had waved me off. Fine, Cassia. If it makes you sleep better at night, write it in. He didn't understand that it wasn't for sleep. It was for survival. A safeguard against the arrogance of men who thought signatures were formalities and that trust was automatic. Now, that clause burned in my mind like a hidden ember. Darren believed he had stripped me of power with a public dismissal. He believed I was just another executive replaced by someone hungrier for credit. But Darren had never stayed awake through midnight conference calls. He had never held the hand of an investor ready to walk away. He didn't know the weight of 17 years, and he didn't know about the clause. I clenched the strap of my bag as I left the building that night, resentment biting at me, but a quiet pride steadying my steps. They had humiliated me, but they hadn't erased me. Not yet. Somewhere, deep in the fine print Darren never bothered to read, my name still mattered. Resentment had carved itself deep into my chest, but nothing sickened me more than the thought of who now held power inside Holt Global. Darren Holt, the CEO's son-in-law, was the embodiment of everything I despised about corporate nepotism. He hadn't earned his place. He hadn't sweated through negotiations or carried the weight of investor confidence on his back. He hadn't lost sleep over market collapses or fought to rebuild trust after economic downturns. Darren had walked into privilege through the back door of marriage, sliding a wedding ring onto the CEO's daughter's hand and, in exchange, receiving a title he never deserved. It disgusted me to watch him parade through the office in tailored suits, his smile polished, his handshake firm. As if that were enough to convince the world of competence. He had no scars from failure, no wisdom born of mistakes. He thrived not on merit, but on appearances. The kind of man who thought charisma could replace discipline. And yet, in a family-run empire, appearances mattered more than substance. The clearest memory I had of Darren's incompetence came 2 years earlier. He had championed an aggressive investment scheme, a high-risk energy merger that looked dazzling on paper but reeked of instability beneath the surface. The numbers didn't add up. I saw through it instantly. In that board meeting, with investors watching closely, Darren had strutted through his presentation, pitching the merger like a salesman pushing snake oil. When my turn came, I stood, calm but firm, and dismantled his proposal line by line. I showed how the debt ratios would cripple liquidity, how the promised returns depended on projections that ignored basic market volatility. I revealed the cracks in his foundation until even the CEO leaned back in unease. The merger was killed that day. Investors thanked me quietly afterward for protecting their capital. But Darren never forgot. The humiliation on his face was seared into memory, his jaw tight, his eyes cold, his knuckles white on the table. He had been stripped of credibility in front of the very people he longed to impress. Any rational man would have turned that moment into a lesson. He could have come to me for guidance, could have sought mentorship, could have learned the discipline behind financial architecture. But Darren wasn't rational. He was entitled. Instead of learning, he plotted. I noticed it in small ways at first. My name removed from internal briefings, projects I had led suddenly attributed to others, meetings scheduled without me, though the contracts bore my fingerprints. Darren was careful, subtle, operating in the shadows where nepotism thrives best. And whenever I confronted the gaps, the CEO brushed it off with a paternal smile. Don't worry, Cassia. Darren is just trying to find his footing. Find his footing? He wasn't climbing. He was climbing over me. The injustice burned hotter with each passing month. I had given my health, my time, my loyalty. He had given nothing but a last name, and yet the scales tilted in his favor. My sacrifices were invisible compared to his connections. Still, I held my ground. I told myself integrity would matter in the long run, that investors would remember who safeguarded their money. And perhaps they did. But Darren was patient in his own way, his resentment brewing into strategy. He didn't just want credit. He wanted me erased from the narrative altogether. The public dismissal at the banquet hall was not a rash act. It was the culmination of years of bitterness, a carefully constructed plan to ensure that when the company's brightest moment arrived, I would not be allowed to share in it. And that was the twist that gnawed at me most. He had the chance to grow, to build, to earn respect. But instead of lifting himself up, Darren chose to drag me down. It was nepotism at its ugliest form, injustice sharpened into a weapon. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of his smirk, I felt not just disgust, but the cold clarity of truth. Darren Holt wasn't content to succeed. He wanted to erase the one person who had proved he never could. The champagne still clung faintly to the air as security closed in. Two men in dark suits flanked me, their expressions rigid and impersonal, as though I were a trespasser instead of the woman who had just delivered the company's largest contract. "Please come with us, Ms. Vale," one of them said flatly. The words hollowed me out. Colleagues I had mentored sat frozen at their tables, unable to meet my eyes. I caught sight of one junior associate, bright, ambitious, still fresh enough to believe in fairness, her gaze flickering toward me in silent protest before she quickly looked away. No one stood up, no one spoke, no one. The shame was mine to carry alone. Each step through the hall was a spotlight of humiliation. Conversations died. Glasses clinked nervously, and the thud of my heels on the polished floor echoed louder than any applause ever had. I had envisioned my departure from Holt Global many times, but never like this. Not stripped of dignity, not as a spectacle. The lobby felt colder than the banquet room. I remembered when that marble floor had felt like a rival, my first day 17 years ago. Walking across it with excitement humming in my chest, clutching my employee badge like it was a key to destiny. Tonight, the same badge dangled uselessly at my side, its weight now more punishment than privilege. At the revolving doors, one of the guards gestured. "Your badge. Please." I hesitated, staring down at the plastic card with my picture, my name, the years it represented. Handing it over felt like tearing off skin. Slowly, I pressed it against the reader. A harsh red light flashed. Access denied. The sound was final, brutal, echoing like a gavel strike. My badge was dead. In that instant, I was no longer Cassia Vale, Senior Vice President of Financial Architecture. I was nobody. The guard took the card from my hand and tossed it into a tray with practiced indifference, as though it were trash. My humiliation was complete, 17 years reduced to a blinking red denial at the company's door. Outside, the night air hit me like a slap. I stood there, alone on the sidewalk, the glow of the building towering behind me. Inside, laughter would soon return, Darren basking in his hollow triumph. Out here, I had only silence and the sting of isolation. I told myself to breathe, but resentment burned hotter with every inhale. They had erased me with a smirk and a swipe, and the world spun on as if I had never mattered. For a moment, I believed Darren had won. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting another empty calendar reminder. Instead, my email lit up with a subject line that froze me in place. Safeguard countdown active. My heart kicked hard, hands trembling. I opened it. The automated system I had designed years ago had recognized the badge deactivation as a trigger event. The clause hidden in the fine print was alive, its timer already counting down towards 6:45 a.m. I stood motionless on the sidewalk, cars passing, city lights flickering, while an unexpected spark of defiance cut through my shame. They had cast me out, but they hadn't stripped me of everything. Inside Holt Global, Darren was celebrating his victory. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that humiliation had set something larger into motion. The countdown had begun. The apartment was quiet, but my mind was not. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the small amber bottle that rested just inches from my hand. The label glowed faintly under the lamplight, my heart medication. I should have taken 1 hour ago, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The bitter pills had become symbols of everything I had ignored for Holt Global. Symptoms brushed aside. Warnings silenced. A body pushed too far. Now, with my career stripped away in public disgrace, I wondered if the pills had been wasted after all. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly, each second dragging me closer to morning. Sleep would not come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Darren's smirk, heard the applause turn to whispers, felt the shame of that blinking red light at the company doors. My humiliation clung to me like smoke. I pulled my leather-bound journal closer, the one I had kept hidden for years. My hand trembled as I wrote across a fresh page. 17 years, 15 hours left. The words stared back at me. They weren't just a record, they were a countdown. 15 hours until the safeguard clause completed its cycle. 15 hours until the system I had written either validated my foresight or reduced me to nothing more than a bitter former executive. Anxiety twisted through me, sharp and restless. What if the clause failed? What if the board found a way to override it? What if Darren uncovered the hidden condition before it triggered? I paced the small apartment, pressing my palms against the cool window glass, watching the city lights pulse like a restless heartbeat. The skyline I had once admired now looked like a stage where I was no longer welcome. I told myself to breathe. I tried to recall the nights I had calmed panicked investors with nothing but a steady tone and a detailed report. If I could manage their fear, why couldn't I manage my own? But fear turned in on itself, gnawing at my insides. On the table, my phone buzzed. The sound made me flinch. With shaking fingers, I picked it up, half expecting another cruel message. Another reminder that I had been replaced. But the screen told a different story. New notification. System alert. Subject. Pending authorization. 6:45 a.m. cutoff. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a dream, wasn't paranoia. The safeguard was alive, ticking down just as I had designed it years ago. The system had detected my termination, verified the absence of my signature, and set the timer. At exactly 6:45 in the morning, the reversal protocol would activate unless my authorization intervened. Relief and dread warred inside me. Relief, because the power was still mine. Dread, because the weight of that power pressed heavier with every passing second. The world saw me as discarded, irrelevant. But somewhere in the invisible circuits of Holt Global's financial architecture, my name still mattered. I sank back into the chair, phone clutched in both hands, staring at the message as though it might vanish if I blinked. Pending authorization. The phrase repeated in my head. Steady as a drumbeat. They had taken my dignity, but they hadn't stripped me of everything, not yet. The anxiety didn't ease, but it shifted. Anticipation began to flicker, faint but undeniable. In 15 hours, Darren would stand in the boardroom believing he had won. In 15 hours, the CEO would still think silence could bury 17 years of sacrifice. In 15 hours, they would learn what they had overlooked. I glanced again at the bottle of pills. My chest ached. Not just from exhaustion, but from the years of pushing too hard. I swallowed one finally, chasing it with lukewarm water, then pressed my pen back to the page. 15 hours left. I wrote again. Then, beneath it, "We'll see who walks out this time." The clock ticked on, merciless. But for the first time that night, I felt the edge of anticipation slice through the fog of fear. Morning was coming, and with it, the reckoning, the morning after my dismissal. The headlines were already his. I sat at my kitchen table, a cold mug of coffee untouched, as the television flickered with Darren's face. He stood outside Holt Global's headquarters, sleek in his custom-tailored suit, the camera lights catching the gleam of his cufflinks. Reporters leaned forward, microphones thrust toward him like offerings. "This marks a new era for Holt Global," Darren declared with a confidence that made my stomach twist. "We are moving into a future of bold leadership, strategic vision, and groundbreaking expansion. The contract signed this week is only the beginning." His words rang hollow to me, but to the world outside, they carried weight. The reporters scribbled furiously, nodding as though he were a visionary. I clenched my hands into fists, nails biting my palms, forcing myself not to shout at the screen. That was my work, my deal, my sleepless nights, my sacrifice. Instead, I swallowed the anger and let it settle deep, burning quietly. Outrage wouldn't serve me, not yet. By noon, the internet was littered with his image. One business magazine had already rushed out a mock-up cover featuring Darren's smirk framed by the words, "Holt Global's New Era." The photo was staged, him gesturing confidently toward a city skyline, eyes bright, jaw firm. To anyone who didn't know the truth, he looked like a man in command. But I knew better. That new era had been built on the back of my labor, on years of negotiations, risk management, and careful architecture. Darren was a figurehead basking in stolen light, arrogance masquerading as leadership. I closed the magazine spread on my laptop with a sharp click, heart hammering. Anger swelled inside me, but I contained it, channeling it into focus. His arrogance was a mask, and masks always crack. That afternoon, while Darren reveled in his victory lap, an internal email circulated within the company. It had been leaked to me through a sympathetic contact still loyal to me inside. The email recapped the press conference, attaching glowing praise for Darren's performance. But buried halfway down was a small line from the legal department. It read, "Pending confirmation required for Cassia Vale's digital authorization on contract 482B. My pulse quickened. They knew. Later. I heard what happened in Darren's office. A company lawyer, a cautious man I remembered well, had quietly raised the matter during a follow-up meeting. "Mr. Holt," he began carefully, "our records indicate that the recent $480 million contract still requires Ms. Vale's signature under the safeguard clause. It would be prudent to address this immediately." Darren had laughed. "She's irrelevant now," he interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "The board made its decision. We don't need her anymore." That arrogance, the certainty that rules and safeguards didn't apply to him, was his trademark. It was the same arrogance that had driven him to push reckless deals in the past. The same arrogance that convinced him nepotism was equivalent to merit. He believed the clause was nothing more than fine print, a technicality that could be ignored. But I had written that fine print, and I knew better. I imagined the scene vividly. Darren smirking in his office, dismissing the lawyer with a wave, convinced the spotlight would never dim. Meanwhile, the clock continued ticking toward 6:45 a.m., the safeguards cutoff approaching with every passing hour. Contained anger pulsed through me like a second heartbeat. I wanted to scream at the world for swallowing his lies, for plastering his face across covers that should have borne mine. But instead, I folded my journal shut, whispering to myself, "Patience. The truth will speak soon enough. Arrogance blinds. Contained anger sharpens. And I knew whose vision would matter when the clock struck. The apartment felt too large and too small all at once. Every corner echoed with silence. And yet the air pressed down on me as if the walls were closing in. I sat at the edge of the couch, knees pulled close, my eyes fixed on the clock across the room. Its second hand jerked forward again and again, each tick sharp as the stab of a blade. 5 hours left. The journal lay open beside me, filled with restless handwriting from the night before. I had written and rewritten the same words. 17 years, 15 hours left, as though repetition could give me control. But now, with the countdown shrinking, the words looked foreign, like the scrawl of a desperate stranger. The quiet was unbearable. I turned on the television, only to switch it off seconds later when Darren's face filled the screen again, boasting about his new era. His arrogance was louder than any noise. I paced the apartment, hands running through my hair, heart pounding too fast for comfort. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. Every tick of the clock was a question. What if the safeguard failed? What if Darren had already found a way to override it? I imagined him laughing in his office, flanked by lawyers willing to bend rules to protect him. Fear curled through me, whispering that I might have been too clever for my own good, that they would erase me not just from the company, but from the system I had designed. I sat back down, gripping the arm of the couch until my knuckles whitened. The fear wasn't just about failure. It was about invisibility. For 17 years. I had been the quiet architect, the one who stayed up through the night so others could sign their names in daylight. If the safeguard didn't hold, all of that work, all of me, would disappear without even a whisper. 4 hours left. The ticking grew louder. I could hear it over the hum of the refrigerator. Louder than the passing cars below. It drilled into me, a reminder that time was both my ally and my enemy. I forced myself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I had done this before, in boardrooms where investors panicked, in midnight calls when markets threatened collapse. I had steadied others countless times, but steadying myself felt impossible. My chest tightened as though my body wanted to betray me too. I reached for the bottle of heart pills on the table, rolling it in my palm, the rattle inside like bones in a jar. 3.5 hours left. Then my phone vibrated. The sudden buzz shocked me so much I nearly dropped the pill bottle. My hands shook as I snatched it up, terrified it would be another headline with Darren's grin. Another reminder of everything stolen from me. But the message wasn't from a reporter. It wasn't from anyone I recognized. The number was blocked. No name, no signature. Just 4 words on the screen. Don't panic. The safeguard holds. I blinked, reread it, pressed the phone closer to my face as if proximity could give me certainty. My breath caught. Someone new, someone inside Holt Global was watching the same countdown I was, and they wanted me to know it was still intact. Fear didn't vanish, but it shifted, folding into something sharper. If the system was holding, it meant the clause I had written hadn't been ignored, hadn't been buried under Darren's arrogance, and the fact that someone from within had reached out meant I wasn't as alone as I thought. 3 hours left. I sat back slowly, the phone still glowing in my hand. My heart pounded, but a thin thread of steadiness wove through the panic. Someone on the inside wanted me to endure. Someone still respected the work I had done, the integrity I had carried when others looked the other way. The clock ticked again, slicing the silence, reminding me of how close the moment was. The fear remained heavy, but anticipation flickered beneath it now, fragile but alive. Morning was coming, and with it, truth. The night had been endless. Every second ticked like a hammer against my ribs, every minute stretching into an eternity of fear and anticipation. But now, at last, The clock had reached the moment that all my anxiety had been building toward. 6:45 a.m. I sat in a quiet cafe on the corner of a street where the city was just waking up. The chairs were mostly empty, the air still heavy with the smell of fresh croissants and roasted beans. Outside, shopkeepers rolled up metal shutters while commuters trudged toward subways with half-open eyes. No one in that cafe knew the storm about to break, not in the sky, but in the heart of Holt Global. I lifted the warm porcelain mug, savoring the earthy aroma before the sip. My hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in months. Perhaps it was because I knew this moment was no longer mine to control. It was the system's, and the system never lied. Across town, inside Holt Global's servers, the safeguard I had embedded years ago executed its silent verdict. At the exact strike of 6:45 a.m., $2.5 billion of pledged capital began its automatic reversal. The funds drained away, line by line, account by account, returning to their original investors. What had looked solid on Holt Global's balance sheets only hours before now collapsed into empty zeros. The company's accounts were stripped bare. I didn't need to watch numbers on a screen to know it was happening. I could feel it in my bones, in the strange stillness of the air, as if the city itself had paused to witness justice finally catch up. For 17 years, I had carried the unbearable weight of responsibility. I had been the safety net, the one who held billions together, with little more than foresight and discipline. My body bore the scars of those years. Insomnia, heart medication, exhaustion carved into my face. And for what? To be discarded in front of colleagues, humiliated by a man who believed nepotism outweighed merit. But now vindication ran through me like a tide. I took my first sip of coffee. The bitterness hit my tongue at the same instant my phone vibrated sharply against the table. I set the cup down, wiped the rim with a napkin, and glanced at the screen. Breaking news alert. Unexplained capital reversal hits Holt Global. Sources confirm over $2.5 billion drained from company accounts within minutes. Cause unknown. Officials investigating. The headline glowed across the phone's glass. Crisp and final. I let the words sink in, the weight of them heavy yet liberating. Unexplained, they wrote. But I knew, and somewhere, in a boardroom filled with panic. Darren and his father-in-law were learning too. I leaned back in my chair, eyes half closing as I listened to the cafe hum with small talk. The hiss of milk steaming, the faint jazz playing overhead. No one knew I was the architect of the collapse making headlines. No one recognized the woman in the corner booth as the same Cassia Vale Darren had dismissed as irrelevant only hours earlier. And that anonymity was its own kind of freedom. Vindication didn't need applause. It didn't need recognition. It only needed truth. And truth had just carved its way through Holt Global's empire like a silent knife. I traced my finger along the rim of the mug and allowed myself the smallest smile. For once, I wasn't carrying the company's weight. For once, I wasn't the one saving them from ruin. I was simply watching justice unfold, coffee in hand, as the empire that had discarded me unraveled in real time. And it was only just beginning. The first wave of panic hit Holt Global before the stock market even opened. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the top floor of the glass tower looked nothing like the polished sanctuary it had the night before. Phones rang off the hook. Screens blinked with flashing red alerts, and assistants scurried from office to office, clutching papers they barely understood. The calm order of corporate routine had been replaced by a frantic scramble that reeked of fear. At the center of it all, Darren Holt was unraveling. He stood in his corner office, jacket discarded, sweat bleeding through the crisp shirt that only yesterday had made him look like a rising star. His hair clung damp to his forehead as he jabbed at his phone, barking at anyone who answered. "Fix it! I don't care what it takes! Just get the money back!" But there was no money to get back. The $2.5 billion had vanished as swiftly as if the ground itself had swallowed it whole. Accounts that had looked full and healthy at midnight now showed nothing but hollow zeros. The reversal protocol had left no trace but the empty shells of balances. Across the hall, the CEO, his father-in-law, was in even worse shape. His voice boomed through the office as he shouted into the phone at one of the banks. "You listen to me! That collateral was secure. Secure! You can't just pull billions overnight. There are safeguards, damn it!" The irony of his words went unnoticed by him, but not by the staff cowering nearby. Safeguards. Yes, there had been safeguards, just not the ones he imagined. Interns whispered to one another, paralegals stared wide-eyed at screens, and senior managers traded helpless looks. The collapse wasn't just financial, it was reputational. The media had already seized on the breaking story. Unexplained capital reversal at Holt Global, anchors speculated. Analysts shook their heads, and investors demanded answers that Darren couldn't give. Inside the boardroom, the chaos reached its peak. The long mahogany table was littered with half-empty coffee cups, crumpled reports, and phones buzzing with calls from furious shareholders. Darren paced like a caged animal, slamming his hand against the table hard enough to make a water glass tip over. "This is sabotage!" he shouted. "Somebody on the inside has rigged the system. We'll find them. We'll crush them. Nobody does this to Holt Global." The words rang hollow even as he said them. Everyone in that room knew he was flailing. His eyes darted from face to face, desperate for someone to provide a lifeline. None came. Then, slowly, the CFO cleared his throat. A quiet man by nature, the CFO had survived the chaos of corporate finance by never raising his voice, by always having his facts straight. But today, he looked pale, almost sick, as he adjusted his glasses and spoke in a tone barely above a whisper. "Mr. Holt, there's something you need to understand." Darren spun toward him. "Then explain it!" The CFO swallowed hard, eyes flickering toward the CEO, before landing back on Darren. "The $2.5 billion wasn't company money." Silence blanketed the room for a moment, broken only by the buzz of unanswered calls. "What do you mean it wasn't company money?" Darren demanded, voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. The CFO took off his glasses, rubbed them with a handkerchief, then replaced them as though stalling for time. His words came slowly, each one a nail in the coffin. "It was collateral, your father-in-law's personal assets, properties, private accounts, even the family trust, all pledged to make the books look stronger than they were." The CEO slammed a fist onto the table, eyes wild. "You weren't supposed to say that," he roared. But the truth was out, hanging in the air like smoke. Darren staggered back a step, his face draining of color. Sweat pooled at his collar as the reality sank in. This wasn't just a financial disaster, this was personal ruin. The room erupted into overlapping shouts, managers demanding guidance, lawyers scrambling for damage control, assistants whispering frantically into phones. The empire that had seemed untouchable hours earlier was imploding in real time, and though I wasn't there to witness it, I could imagine every detail. Darren's panic, the CEO's fury, the CFO's reluctant confession. They had thought me irrelevant, but as their world burned around them, I knew the truth was settling in. The key they had discarded was the one that had unlocked their collapse. By the time the market bell rang that morning, Holt Global was already drowning. I sat by the window of the cafe, sunlight creeping slowly across the table, my second cup of coffee warming my hands. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, buses wheezing, shop doors opening, commuters checking their phones. But inside the financial world, rhythm had been replaced by chaos. Holt Global's stock opened with a sharp drop, within 30 minutes. It had plummeted so fast that trading algorithms froze in panic, halting trades for a brief moment before releasing again into freefall. Phones buzzed constantly around me with push notifications. Holt Global loses 40% of market value in first hour. By noon, that number had deepened into catastrophe. 72% erased in a single day. Investors who had once praised the company's stability fled in droves. Fund managers called for emergency meetings. Private equity groups severed ties. And long-term partners pulled contracts overnight. Even those who once claimed loyalty could smell the collapse. And no one wanted to be caught in the rubble. I watched it all unfold on my laptop. The red downward graphs almost hypnotic. A grim satisfaction rooted itself deep inside me. It wasn't joy, not exactly. Too many people, innocent employees, would pay for Darren's arrogance and the CEO's hubris. But there was something undeniable in seeing the empire that had humiliated me finally face its own reckoning. On the television, mounted above the cafe counter, a news anchor's voice carried over the hum of conversation. "Markets are stunned this morning by the rapid collapse of Holt Global," she said crisply. "Sources confirm that $2.5 billion was unexpectedly withdrawn in the early hours, leaving the company insolvent. Analysts are pointing fingers at Darren Holt, now being dubbed—" She paused, glancing at her notes before continuing. "The man who fired the architect before collapse." The camera cut to a photograph of Darren leaving the building. His face pale, his tie loosened, reporters swarming him with questions he had no answers for. I let out a slow breath. Once. Those headlines would have been mine. My name would have been linked with success, my work with resilience. Instead, my name was absent, erased. But Darren's, his name would now live in infamy. And in a way, that was enough. The CEO, I imagined, was raging in silence. His personal fortune gutted, his reputation in tatters, the family empire collapsing under the weight of secrets he had thought would never surface. Holt Global had been built on illusion, and illusions can't survive daylight. Then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife deeper, another headline flashed across my screen. A rival company, one that had long competed with Holt Global for investor trust, launched a bold new ad campaign at the very peak of the scandal. The words stretched across the screen in stark white letters against a black background. Trust built on real assets. It was brutal in its precision, perfectly timed to hit when Holt Global looked weakest. The rival didn't need to mention names. Everyone knew who the target was. The ad spread instantly across social media, praised for its audacity, shared by thousands who relished the downfall of a giant. I closed the laptop and wrapped my hands around the coffee mug once more. Outside, the city was unchanged, indifferent to the ruin unfolding in its tallest towers. But I felt the shift deep inside me. For 17 years, I had carried their weight. Today, I carried only my own. And as Holt Global collapsed into freefall, I felt the grim satisfaction of knowing that arrogance and deception had finally destroyed themselves. The day after Holt Global's collapse felt strangely quiet, for the first time in years. I woke without an alarm, without a meeting to prepare for, without a weight pressing on my chest, reminding me of the work waiting to consume me. The sun spilled through the blinds of my apartment, soft and golden, and I let it linger on my face. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was freedom. I made coffee slowly, deliberately, savoring each step, the grind of beans, the hiss of water, the warmth of the mug in my hand. 17 years of my life had been spent rushing, sprinting from crisis to crisis, tethered to the company like a lifeline that cut deeper each year. Now, with Holt Global in ruins, I finally allowed myself to move at a human pace. Still, part of me braced for regret, for the gnawing emptiness of being cast aside, for the loneliness of being invisible. But instead, there was only clarity. I hadn't been erased. The world now knew the truth. And Darren, the man who had sought to bury me, would spend the rest of his life living under the headline that tied his name to destruction. By mid-morning, I opened my laptop, intending only to scroll through the news. The financial press was still ablaze with Holt Global's downfall. Phrases like corporate negligence and arrogance exposed splashed across every screen. But one notification in my inbox caught my eye. It was an email from a name I recognized instantly. I could see his face in my memory, the steady gaze of the investor who had given me that small, almost imperceptible nod during the banquet hall humiliation. In that silent gesture, he had acknowledged my worth when everyone else had looked away. Now his acknowledgement was louder, clearer, undeniable. "Cassia," the message began. "Yesterday proved what many of us already suspected. You were the architect behind Holt Global's strength, and without you, the foundation crumbled. Our firm would be honored to bring you on as an independent advisor. We value insight born from experience, not just titles granted by proximity to power." I read the words twice, then a third time, my throat tightening. For so long, I had been defined by Holt Global, by the title they gave me and then stripped away. But here was recognition not for a title, but for the substance that had always been mine. At the bottom of the message was a single line, almost casual, but it cut through me with unexpected force. "We value resilience more than titles." I stared at that sentence until the letters blurred. Resilience. The word encompassed everything I had carried: nights in hospital beds with my laptop, years of sacrifice no one applauded, humiliation endured without surrender. Titles had been used to control me, to dismiss me. But resilience, that was mine. That was something no one could take away. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the city outside blending with the steady beat of my heart. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt. I felt lighter, as if some invisible chain had fallen away. Liberation didn't arrive in shouts or headlines. It arrived in the quiet certainty that I was no longer defined by those who had underestimated me. I typed my reply slowly, deliberately, every word chosen with care. "Thank you for your faith. I accept." As I pressed send, I felt something shift deep inside. Dignity, stripped from me in front of a crowd, had been restored, not by Holt Global, not by Darren, but by the recognition of those who truly saw me. And in that quiet moment, I realized something even greater. Freedom wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself. The cafe door swung shut behind me, and for a moment I just stood there on the sidewalk, feeling the cool morning air on my face. The city was alive now, buses groaning past, cyclists weaving through traffic, the chatter of pedestrians carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life moved forward. As it always did, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my employee badge. The laminated card, with its faded picture and plastic edges worn smooth by years of use, had once been my identity. 17 years of sacrifice had been bound to that little piece of plastic. Sleepless nights, frantic negotiations, and even hospital stays, all tethered to a card that granted access to elevators and conference rooms, but never to respect. I turned it over in my hand once more. Then, without hesitation, I dropped it into the trash can beside the cafe. The sound was soft, almost anticlimactic, but to me it was deafening. It was the sound of release. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I felt no weight on my shoulders, no deadlines clawing at my back, no boardroom whispers eroding my worth, no pills lined up on the kitchen counter as payment for another overworked night. My chest felt lighter, my heart beat steady, unburdened. I was no longer defined by Holt Global or by the men who had dismissed me. I looked upward. The sun was rising, bleeding gold and crimson across the skyline, casting long shadows that made the city glow. I tilted my head back and let the warmth wash over me. It felt like standing in a new beginning. Then my phone vibrated. I hesitated, half expecting another headline, another reminder of chaos inside Holt Global's tower. But when I pulled the device from my pocket, the message on the screen was something entirely different. For every worker they underestimated, you proved them wrong. The sender was anonymous, but it didn't matter. My throat tightened as I read the words again. They weren't meant only for me. They were meant for everyone who had ever been silenced in a meeting, passed over for promotion, or told they were expendable. The message was a torch, and I knew I had carried it here, not just for myself, but for all of them. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, the words still echoing in my chest. Justice had arrived, not in the form of vengeance alone, but in truth revealed. Darren's arrogance had collapsed, the CEO's illusions had shattered, and Holt Global's empire of pretense had fallen. What stood now was not me against them, but me reclaiming my dignity, and in doing so, shining a light for the undervalued everywhere. I inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I wasn't broken. I wasn't discarded. I was free. As I walked down the street, I realized something profound. Liberation doesn't come when others finally recognize your worth. Liberation comes when you stop waiting for them to decide it. 17 years of sacrifice had ended in betrayal, but those years were not wasted. They had forged resilience, sharpened my vision, and taught me a truth I carried into this sunrise. They may own the titles, but they will never own the spirit of those who build everything beneath them. And maybe, just maybe, my story would remind someone else sitting at their own kitchen table, staring at their own pill bottle, that they are worth more than the walls trying to contain them. Because in the end, dignity is not given, it is reclaimed. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt underestimated at work or seen arrogance collapse under its own weight? Share your experiences in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories of resilience, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that justice has many forms, sometimes quiet, sometimes explosive, but always powerful.